My in-laws sat my parents by the kitchen at my own wedding, and I had one announcement to make. I saw it the moment I walked into the reception hall. My mom's navy dress tucked at a table beside the swinging kitchen doors, servers brushing past her chair every few minutes, the smell of seared salmon and clattering trays drifting over her shoulder. My dad sat beside her, squinting at a place card that read, "Family. Overflow," turning it over in his hands like it might say something different on the back. 200 guests, white linen, candlelight, a string quartet by the windows. And my parents, who'd raised me on a firefighter's pension and my mom's part-time bookkeeping job, seated where the kitchen doors swung open every 40 seconds, loud enough that they had to lean in to hear each other talk. I stood in the entrance in my wedding dress, guests already turning to smile at me, and for one long second, all I could see was that table. My name is Rachel. I'm 30 years old, an event contracts manager. I've spent 7 years making sure clients get exactly what they were promised on paper, down to the linen color and the seating chart. The irony of my own wedding wasn't lost on me, standing there in the doorway. My in-laws, the Whitfields, come from 3 generations of old family money. A name on a hospital wing, a lake house that's been in a magazine. My husband, Daniel, is nothing like them, which is part of why I married him. But his mother, Diane, has spent 2 years finding small, deniable ways to remind my side of the family where we rank. It started early. At our engagement dinner, Diane sat my parents at the far end of the table, near the coat check, while Daniel's aunts and cousins filled in around us. When our engagement photos went up on the Whitfield family Instagram, my parents were cropped out of 2 of the 4. "Just for spacing," Diane said when I asked. At the rehearsal dinner, she toasted the 2 families joining together, then spent 4 full minutes on Whitfield family history and 11 seconds on mine. I noticed every one of these things. I filed them away, the way I file every contract discrepancy at work, not because I was planning anything, but because that's simply how my mind works. Small inconsistencies matter. They tell you what someone actually intends underneath what they say out loud. 3 months before the wedding, I built the seating chart myself. I sent it to the planner, to Daniel, and to Diane for final sign-off. My parents were seated at table 3, 10 feet from the head table, next to Daniel's favorite uncle, a retired teacher who'd have gotten along with my dad instantly. Diane replied to the email with a single line. "Looks great. Thanks, Rachel." I didn't check again. That was my mistake, if you can call trusting someone a mistake. The morning of the wedding was a blur of hairpins and steamed lace, and my mother crying happy tears in the mirror behind me. I didn't see the final printed chart. I didn't think I needed to. So when I walked into that reception and saw my parents at the kitchen table, my first feeling wasn't rage. It was a strange, hollow embarrassment. For them, not for me. I watched my mom adjust her chair every time a server pushed through the doors, watched her smile anyway, watched her make polite conversation with a second cousin of Daniel's she'd never met, because that's who my parents are. They don't make scenes. They absorb. I smiled through the ceremony photos. I danced my first dance. I let Diane hold both my hands for the cameras and tell a photographer, "Doesn't she look like she married into the right family?" I said nothing. I filed it. But I watched, all night, the small choreography of it. Diane's glance toward the planner when my mother stood to use the restroom, the planner's apologetic shrug back, like they'd already discussed this and settled on "we'll deal with it later" as their answer. I watched my father-in-law avoid eye contact with my dad for the entire reception, the 2 men who should have been the connective tissue between our families, sitting 40 feet apart all night. At one point, my dad caught my eye across the room. He didn't say anything. He just gave me the smallest nod, the same nod he used to give me from the bleachers at my track meets, the one that meant "I see you, keep going, don't worry about me." That nod is the thing I remember most clearly from my own wedding day, not the vows, that nod. I didn't confront Diane that night. I danced. I toasted. I thanked everyone by name in my speech, including my parents, and watched Diane's smile tighten slightly when I did. 3 days later, the Whitfields hosted a thank you brunch for close family, the kind of event where the real accounting of a wedding happens, where everyone compares notes on what went right and what went sideways, dressed up as pleasant conversation over mimosas. I'd spent those 3 days doing what I do for a living. I pulled the original seating chart with my email approval timestamp. I pulled Diane's one-line reply. I pulled the vendor invoice showing my parents had personally paid for the string quartet and half the flowers, a fact Diane had conveniently mentioned to guests as the Whitfield family's touches. I printed 3 copies. I put them in a folder. Not for revenge, for clarity. I hadn't planned a scene. I'd planned an announcement, the kind you make once you're done editing yourself down to keep everyone else comfortable. Brunch went the way these things go. Mimosas, pastries, Diane holding court about the flowers, the venue, the magical energy of the night. Daniel sat beside me, quiet, watching his mother the way he'd started watching her more closely since the rehearsal dinner toast. Before the toasts began, I stood up. The room quieted the way rooms do when someone stands who doesn't usually make speeches. I thanked the Whitfields, sincerely, for hosting a beautiful wedding. Then I said evenly, without raising my voice, that I wanted to correct something publicly, because I didn't want it sitting quietly in the background of our marriage from day one. I said my parents had personally covered the string quartet and half the floral budget. I said they'd been placed at the confirmed seating chart, next to the head table, and that chart had been changed after Diane approved it, moving them beside the kitchen doors without anyone telling me or them. I placed the folder on the table, not to embarrass anyone, because in rooms like that, feelings get denied, but paperwork doesn't. Then I said I loved my husband, and I was building a life with him, not with people who couldn't find room for my mother at her own daughter's wedding. And I sat down. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted, the way I count silences in client meetings when a hard truth has just landed and everyone's deciding whether to acknowledge it or pretend it didn't happen. Diane's face moved through 3 expressions: surprise, then something brittle, then the practiced, wounded innocence I'd seen her use before. "That must have been the planner's mistake," she said. "I'll have to speak with her." Daniel didn't rush to smooth it over, which surprised me more than anything else that day. He looked at his mother and asked quietly why the chart he'd also signed off on had changed without either of us being told. Diane didn't have an answer that survived more than one follow-up question. My mother said nothing the entire time. My father reached over under the table and took my hand. In the weeks that followed, the apologies came in, some that sounded sincere, some that sounded like damage control dressed up as sincerity. Diane called my mother directly, which she'd never done before. She started addressing holiday invitations to both my parents by name instead of "and family." Small things. They mattered more than she probably realized. Daniel and I talked more after that brunch about the family we were actually building, not the one performed for photographers, but the one that shows up for each other in the unglamorous, unattended moments. He started calling my dad more. He noticed things he hadn't noticed before. I didn't blow up a family that day. I didn't need to. I refused to let a quiet insult stay quiet, and I said so once, clearly with the facts in hand, in front of the people who'd hoped I never would. My parents still bring up that brunch sometimes, usually in passing, usually with something closer to relief in their voice than anger. My mom told me months later that what mattered most wasn't the apology. It was watching me stand up before anyone told me to sit down. I think about that a lot. How many small tables people get placed at over a lifetime. How many times they smile through it because making a scene feels like it costs more than staying quiet. I used to think being the reasonable one meant absorbing things gracefully. I don't think that anymore. Sometimes being reasonable means saying the true thing once, calmly, and letting the room sit with it. I built my marriage on the same principle I built my career on. What's written down matters, and so does who gets a seat at the table, literally and otherwise. Now, at every family gathering, my parents sit exactly where they belong. Not because someone remembered to be kind, because I made sure they'd never have to wonder again.